Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to take this Pine Branches or Evergreen Betterpress plate set, and I'm going to use it in a couple different ways. Now, the first way I'm going to use it, I'm going to do a swag on the front of my piece of cardstock here, and then I'm going to foil with it. So I'm going to do both the Betterpress printing as well as foiling with the plate. So for this one, I'm using this particular one here, and I'm actually going to use the Betterpress 3 times with it, and then I'm going to foil on top of it. I'm going to use some Distress Oxide inks here. So the first color I'm going to use is Peeled Paint, and it's darker than the second one I'm going to use. The second one I'm going to use is Bundled Sage, and I wanted to use oxide inks for this because they are a little bit opaque. I wanted to possibly be able to see the bundled sage over top of the peeled paint. In the end, you don't really see that because the details on the Betterpress plates are so fine that you don't really see it. The lines are so fine. But I'm doing the 2 on the side first, and I'm doing those with the peeled paint, and then I'm going to do 1 in the center, and then I'll do that with bundled sage. So it's really easy to keep moving my Betterpress plate, aligning it, and then putting the plate on top of it and running it through the machine. Now, all of those lines on the chase, I think I keep getting chase and platen mixed up, of the base of the Betterpress makes it really easy to know exactly where it's going to go on the front of the card. I've got a piece of hammer mill cardstock here that I'm using, and it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so it perfectly fits in the smaller of the rectangles. For this last one here, I decided to do it a 4th time. My middle one didn't go as low as I wanted it to go, so it's really easy to just lower that, just ink that bottom part of it. I didn't ink the entire thing, and then do it again. And then I have a nice sprig of branches that I really like. I used just a baby wipe to clean off my base of my Betterpress, and then I'm going to put that away and heat up my Glimmer machine. Now for the Glimmer machine, I'm using Aura foil. It's a gold foil that has some holographic properties to it, so I think it's going to look really pretty on top of the green Betterpress printing. Now, I did use one of the different branches from the set just for a little bit of variation. You could use whichever one you want. What I like about foiling on top of it is it's not in your face foiling. It's not, it's very subtle. So at first you don't really notice it, and then when you put it in the light, tilted in the light, you see a little bit of glimmer or shimmer from it. The next thing I did was I took a whole 1/4 sheet of hammer mill, and I foiled the entire thing with the same Aura foil. This I'm going to use as my mat around my printed piece. And it's really easy to do an entire piece with a solid hot foil plate here. That one is from Pinkfresh Studios, and it just covers that entire sheet. Now I want to put a bow on my pine sprigs. So here's a little trick that I like to do when I have something or a specialty cardstock that I want to mat around something. That center part is totally being covered, and as long as you have a nice quality cardstock that's not see-through, no one's going to know if anything's die cut out of it. I've done this for years, and anytime I've told people that, they're always very surprised about this, but you can't tell. Even if you hold this to the light, you can't see that there's something die cut out of this. So rather than taking an extra piece of cardstock and an extra piece of foil, I might as well utilize the part that's being covered and just take a little chunk out of that to die cut the bow. Now this verse here, you're going to see it later on in the video, foiling that. I actually videotaped this in reverse. I have 2 cards here that I'm doing. This is the simpler of the 2, and if you wanted to take it to the next level, we're going to do a wreath next. And in that part there I do the verses, but I videotaped the wreath first, and I was planning on just talking about the Pine Branches, and I thought I might as well just do it. So here I'm doing the wreath. I've got the same sized piece of hammer mill cardstock. It's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm using hammer mill because of the foiling afterwards. It does Betterpress beautifully, so you don't have to worry about the cardstock not taking the Betterpress plates well. It absolutely does. But my main reason for choosing it is because I'm going to foil on it afterwards. And what I'm going to do this wreath is I'm going to basically make a square out of those pine branches, and then I'm going to tilt that square and make a kind of a diamond out of it. And when you do that, it creates a really cool wreath. I'm using the same 2 oxide colors. So for my first square, I'm using the peeled paint, and for my tilted square, I'm using bundled sage. But once again, you don't really see the difference between the two colors a lot. Like it's subtle, you have to look for it. If you didn't know it was there, you probably wouldn't even notice. The one thing that I would suggest changing on this, and this is something that I noticed once my card was totally done, rather than inking that entire Betterpress plate, I would only ink that branch and leave that stem off. And when you look at the finished card at the end, there's a couple of those branches that are sticking out. And it's one of those things that I don't think you'd really notice. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's something that after the fact I would have changed. And when it comes to the foiling part, I kind of realized this then. So when I go do the foiling part of this, I don't foil the branch. I only foil the pine part of it, and you'll see that in a minute. So here I've got my first square done, and now I'm going to do my tilted square. Now I am using the lines on the base of the Betterpress and making sure that these plates are at least a 1/4 inch from that edge. That way I have room to cut this down a little bit so I can see my mat behind it, because I am going to do another mat for this one. It just kind of ties everything in by having that mat around it, and it's a really pretty, that aura foil is so pretty with the opalescent look to it. So I like to kind of tie everything in. It also is the same foil that I'm using for the verses, so it just kind of all goes together. So you can see how quickly this goes, just moving that plate around, and I'm making sure as I'm moving it around that that branch isn't getting flipped around. So my branches are all going exactly the same way for both layers of this. Now, for this particular one, I'm using my Betterpress system. This would work exactly the same if you wanted to use a stamp. You could do this way. You could stamp it with inks first, make sure to heat set them if they're inks that stay wet for a while, and then you could stamp and emboss and get a very similar look that way. I just wanted to use my Betterpress as well as my Glimmer machine, but if you don't have these systems, you can absolutely use a stamp and just stamp them. Another thing is, if you like die cutting, this is a great way to create a wreath out of a pine die. You do the exact same steps. You do the first square and then you do a tilted square, but as you're doing it, you're just going to tip your tuck the branch part of your die cut underneath the other ones, and you get a nice dimensional textured wreath out of it. So now I'm using my aura foil, and I'm just cutting pieces that are about the same size as my plate here. And you can see as I tape it down, I'm not putting that foil underneath the branch. I'm only putting it under the pine part of it. And by taping it down, I know it's going to foil exactly where I want it to foil. I don't have to worry about it moving on me. I'm also going to take that foil and cut off any excess pieces. I don't want to chance overfoiling here. There's one part where I get a little bit of overfoiling, but I use a sand eraser to remove it. And in the end, that's where my sentiment went on the front of the card anyways, so I didn't even need to necessarily use that sand eraser. But just know that if you happen to have issues with it, you can use a sand eraser, and that will, at the very minimum, dull it a little bit. So I'm going to be doing this 8 times. So yeah, it's a labor of love. You have to do it 8 times. You can't do multiple plates while foiling. Technically, if you had multiples of this Betterpress set, or you wanted to do some different branches, you could. I wanted all my branches to be the same. So I did it 8 times, and it really kind of goes fairly quickly as you're doing it. While I'm doing it, while I'm waiting for some of the timer buttons to go off, I am going to foil my verses, and I also foil the full piece for the back. So while I'm waiting for my timer, I'm utilizing my time by getting other things prepped so that I can make the most of my time. So the verses that I'm using are some really nice, they're called Joyful Sentiments. They are a glimmer plate, and they also have a die cut to cut it out. And I love the fact that all of those sentiments get foiled at the same time. And then when you use the die cut, all of them get cut out at the same time. So you get 5 different sentiments all at once. So it's a great way to make up several sentiments to use for several different projects. You can tuck the other ones away for future projects. Now, because for this wreath, I use the Betterpress 8 times to create the wreath, as well as the foiling machine 8 times to do the foiling of the branches, I could see how it's a little bit too much for someone to go through that whole process, which is why I included the card at the beginning. You're using exactly the same supplies, but there's just less repetition. So if you're beginner, or if you're new to using the Betterpress system or new to Glimmer foiling, it's just a simpler version. And then if you wanted to go a little bit more elaborate, you could absolutely do the wreath with it. And it's always nice to have more things that you can do with your supplies. So for this background here that's foiled, I only cut off about 1/8 of an inch. And then when it comes to my wreath image, I'm actually cutting off 3/8 of an inch. So when I go put this on my card background is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I want to have a very thin white outline and then my mat, and then I'm going to have my image piece. Off camera, I die cut some cardstock scraps with the die from the sentiments and just put it behind there to give it a little bit extra dimension. Once I was done layering the stuff for my card, I decided I wanted to have some of the poinsettias from the Christmas blooms die, as well as the bow from the parcel and post die. My wreath, while I liked it, I thought it just needed something a little bit different. So I took my mat and I cut some small poinsettias out of it. Then I used just some white cardstock scraps for the large poinsettias, and I used some white glitter cardstock for the bow. I die cut them all with the Platinum 6 machine, and now I'm just layering my poinsettias together. I like to do this off of the card so that the glue has a few minutes to dry and set up before I add it to the card. I also use my fingers to kind of curl the petals. It gives them some extra dimension and, in my opinion, makes them look a little bit more lifelike. Now, I did put gold in the center of these poinsettias. If I had a gold ink pad that I really loved, I probably would have just inked the center gold so it was a little bit more subtle. The one that I had is totally dried out, so I just tossed it. But as a nice alternative, cutting out some poinsettias works as well. I think they would just be a little bit more noticeable if there was more white for the poinsettia and it was just inked gold inside. But just know that there's different alternatives, different solutions, different ways to do different things. I'm using Barely Art glue to glue it together, just putting it around the outside and then shimmering, and then putting a little bit in the center. I like to put an acrylic block on there while my glue is setting up. This glue is a little bit more liquid from what I'm used to, which is great for using with detailed dies. You can get really tiny dots in there. So I placed my bigger poinsettia in the center, and now I'm placing my two smaller ones. The poinsettia from the Christmas blooms die, there's two sizes to it. I always like to layer that center one with two of the small ones and then offset them. For the bigger die, I also put the big one behind it. So I placed those on the top of my wreath and then just put my bow underneath it, just to give it a little bit of dimension, a little bit more interest to that bow. And then I have my sentiment on the card as well, which is also a little bit more dimensional because I put those cardstock layers behind it. I decided to use some Pinkfresh champagne glitter gems to put on the center of the poinsettias, and then I thought it might look nice to have some scattered around the wreath as well. So I'm using some Distress Collage medium to glue those in place. I use the collage medium for this part here because it's a little bit thicker. I wanted those gems to really stick on quite quickly, and I wanted to reduce the amount of time that it might take for them to dry. You could use the Barely Art glue as well. I just was a little bit impatient here and decided to use the collage medium for this. I'm using some tweezers to pick up those gems and put them in place. A lot easier than trying to do it with your fingers, and especially since the dots of glue are so tiny, it'd be hard to be holding the gems in your fingers and see the dots of glue. These will take very little time to dry because that glue is a little bit thicker, and you can tilt the card up right away because they're not going to move because that glue is nice and thick. Now I chose the champagne glitter drops with this because it went with the color scheme, and I didn't really want to add any more colors other than the gold and green and white, but you could easily do, say, red poinsettias and then do red glitter gems on here. I think that would be beautiful as well. You could also use stickles, which is a glitter glue, and you can control how big or how small those pieces are. I think that would be a great solution as well. Here are the two cards. This one is the little bit more simpler of the two, and then there is the wreath. I absolutely love how they turned out for both of them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a fantastic day. I really appreciate you being here.